Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to a session on climate finance and what it'll take to actually mobilize sufficient capital for the global south to achieve sustainable development. We are very fortunate today at this panel to have two very experienced investors in the global south. Next to me is Clarissa DeFranco from Allied Climate Partners, and then Woo Chong, who is the CEO of the Global Energy Alliance for People and the Planet. We were going to have Divyata Ashia as well, who's at Fortescue Capital. Unfortunately, she's been held up by traffic and is running very late, so I just told her that it's probably better to pass than to come 20 or 25 minutes late, so we won't be able to have her. But the way we thought we'd run the panel is just start with a quick round of introductions. I'll introduce myself and I'll ask Clarissa and Woo Chong to introduce themselves as well. And then we'll start with going through 3 or 4 very important topics that we think are going to determine how sustainable development happens in the global south. Not necessarily the rich countries of the global north, but what needs to happen in the global south. So let me start with myself. My name is Jayant Sinha. I'm president of Eversource Capital. Eversource Capital runs the largest sustainability infrastructure fund in the global south. We are managing about $740 million in a fund and then another $150 million in separately managed vehicles. We are in the process of raising Fund 2 because we've largely deployed our Fund 1. I'm also a professor in practice at the London School of Economics at the Global School of Sustainability, where we in fact study sustainable development, economic development in general, and the kinds of institutions that are necessary to be able to get a country like India to develop on a sustainable trajectory. So those are the 2 hats I wear. But with that, let me hand it over to Clarissa to introduce herself. Again, as I said, we're very fortunate to have Clarissa and Woo Chong here, very, very experienced in this area. Clarissa, over to you.
Thank you, Jayant, and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Clarissa DeFranco. I'm a senior advisor to Allied Climate Partners, which is a philanthropic organization aggregating capital from sources across the globe to focus it to encourage other investors, ideally private investors which are deep-pocketed, to really focus on climate across emerging markets, the global south. And it's doing that by investing into funds across Southeast Asia, India, Africa, Central America, and the Caribbean. My background is as an emerging markets fund-to-fund investor. Over the last 25 years, I worked for the UK's Development Finance Institution, heading their private equity funds team. I'm originally from Nicaragua, and so emerging markets, global south is what I've lived and breathed over the last 35 years. Thank you for having me.
Good afternoon. My name is Woo Chong. I'm the CEO of the Global Energy Alliance for People Planet since August last year. Our organization is backed by philanthropic foundations, and our objective, our reason for being is pursuing the world where everybody has access to clean, reliable, and uninterrupted electricity, and also enable people who are getting the electricity to use it in a way that uplifts their livelihood. So as a result of that, we are trying to also reduce greenhouse gas to as much as we can. So the way we do it is we create this platform of collaboration across public, private, philanthropic organizations, and which is one of the key things that I'm hearing a lot from this week. Before coming to this organization, I spent a little bit more than 30 years working for one of the regional development banks. And before that, I was in the private sector. So I myself is public-private philanthropy.
Thank you very much, Woo Chong and Clarissa. Now, it's always very exciting to come to New Lab and to see the terrific entrepreneurial energy and the fantastic innovation of the companies that are here, the startups that are here, that are pushing the envelope on climate technology, on material science, on transportation, and so on. Now, along with entrepreneurial energy, for all startups, there is another vital ingredient that propels their success, and that's actually capital. So unless we can get capital to these companies and enable them to scale and grow, we are not going to have the impact and really be able to bend the trajectory of carbon emissions. So to bend the curve, we've got to make sure that all of these terrific startups, terrific companies that are here are getting sufficient capital. And of course, as you all know, Countries in the global north, the richer countries, are doing a terrific job right now of decarbonizing, moving towards cleaner forms of energy and so on. And over the next 20 or 30 years, the real battle to decarbonize, the real battle to reduce carbon emissions will actually be in the global south. In countries like India and Brazil and South Africa and Indonesia, unless we can bend the curve in these countries, we are not going to be able to get to net zero and be able to get a handle on what's happening with respect to climate change. Very, very important that we get these countries on a decarbonization trajectory. Now, how much money is required? Is it a matter of billions or trillions? So let's explore that. Let me ask Clarissa. Clarissa, what is your sense of what's required in countries like India, South Africa, Indonesia? You're operating across all these countries. How much capital do we need to actually bend the curve?
Obviously, there's no fixed number on that. Everybody keeps talking about trillions. But what's really important is recognizing that you need to have very targeted interventions over the next few years to ensure that that gap is reduced over time. The need is in the trillions. The flows today are across the globe, half of that. When you look at these global south markets, it's probably 20% of that. And we really need to be focusing capital allocators to think about how do you understand the opportunity set without believing the risk that exists within those markets. And there's a role for catalytic capital to play in that, to really target and change those perceptions, misperceptions, over-exaggerated risks as the case may be, to ensure that those flows catch up with the demand.
Wuchong, your assessment.
I agree with her in terms of total magnitude. It's just huge. It's in trillions. But how do we unlock the money that's out there? For us to get to trillions, the only way to do that is tapping private sector. And in private sector, it's not about allocation. It's actually providing bankable opportunities for private sector to come in. So the multilateral development banks and other IFIs are trying to do that by creating the enabling environment, by building pipeline and de-risking so that private capital will come in. The issue is the multilateral development banks, which were set up many years ago, they all come with this parameter of AAA. You know, they work in an environment where they need to mobilize resources from the capital market based on the government's, guarantee backing, which means AAA equals risk averse, which means the money doesn't flow to the frontier countries, frontier technologies, early technologies and so forth. So what can we do about it? There was concessional money that was out there from the public sector, like the ODA, but that's being constrained. So where is the potential money? Possibly philanthropy. Now, philanthropy capital is not as big as the official development assistance or private sector. It goes into millions, but it's very powerful because it does not have all the baggage of multilateral requirements. So if you can target investments into the right kind of investments from the philanthropy capital, taking the riskiest position, then you can actually unlock the flow of capital to the places where it didn't go. So that's the way we are trying to see how we can bring all the philanthropic players together and enable the collaboration across the philanthropy, public and private. And our organization is trying to create the platform of the radical collaboration.
And Wuchong, who's sponsoring GAP? Who are the various donors that are doing that?
So we were created in Glasgow 2021 with the initial support from the Rockefeller, IKEA, and the Bezos Earth Fund. But clearly, 3 is not enough. So we're trying to expand now, moving into the second 5 years of our operation, to expand to other philanthropies, but also other corporates, individuals even, because climate is everyone's business, because it will affect everybody in a different way, but it will get affected. So we are trying to create a platform where big and small players can contribute into this, this sort of aggregation.
And Clarissa, which are the sponsors for Allied Climate Partners?
We have a number of family offices, including Three Cairns Group, who was the anchor of Allied Climate Partners, but we also have Bezos Earth Fund, Source Economic Development Fund, and other US-based or European-based family offices. But I just wanted to just really emphasize the point that Wutong made with regards to, how scarce philanthropic capital is and how important it is to leverage that capital to really unlock everything else. We were in a discussion yesterday at Columbia talking about the role that family offices play. What do asset allocators need to do differently? How does foundations, institutional investors need to think about, one, understanding these markets, but also recognizing that they can't replicate what they've been doing in the US or Europe. They really need to be thinking, what is needed in that specific geography? Why is capital not flowing there? What is the risk associated with that? And how do these various institutions work together and actually speak the same language? So as we've been at a DFI, I've been working now with philanthropic capital, and even the use of catalytic means different things for the various entities. So you really need to be thinking about finding a way to translating some of the wording, some of the way people think and how they allocate capital to be able to unlock part of this as well.
Very interesting. So lots of groups of people, particularly philanthropists, are coming together to try and find the capital so that we can, in fact, bend the curve. Now, let's make it very specific, not make it abstract. Let's make it very specific. Let's take the case of India, which I know well. And in India, friends, as you probably have heard, the solar industry, the renewables industry is considered a great success in the global south, right? And we are marching towards a situation where half of our installed capacity, not the energy generated, but half of the installed capacity of 500 gigawatts in India, about 250 gigawatts is now coming from renewables, largely solar, but some wind as well. So that's what we've done, and that's considered a great success, and it is a great success. But for us to be able to make sure that the energy being generated, today if you look at India's power sector, 70% of the kilowatt hours, that is the energy, not the installed capacity, is still coming from thermal sources, still coming from coal. And if you ask people how much money is required annually to be able to flip it over so that most of the energy also comes from renewables and we can drive down carbon emissions, people will tell you that while we've been investing $10 or $15 billion a year, $10 or $15 billion a year in renewables in India, which sounds like a very large number, the actual requirement is 50 billion. So markets working by themselves are delivering 10 or 15 billion right now. But if we really want to bend the curve and we really want to get India to net zero by 2070, as our Prime Minister has declared, we actually need $50 billion a year. And for that, what most economists, most people that think about finance believe that we need some very innovative financial instruments that are called blended finance instruments, where we take certain amount of concessional capital and enable that to enhance returns to commercial capital so we can unlock that commercial capital and get to $50 billion a year. So it's blended finance, people say, is the key that's going to unlock these flows of commercial capital. So Clarissa, tell us a little bit about blended finance. How do you see that working?
As you said, Jai, blended finance is about reducing risk, reducing the perceived risk on something. And there's a couple of ways of doing that. One school of thought is it's all about providing first loss, so protecting downside. Other people think that it is about enhancing upside and finding ways of increasing the returns of a project or a fund transaction. That sounds pretty simple. But implementing that and seeing how that's applied to projects and funds gets very complicated. The way Allied Climate Partners thinks about catalytic capital and blended finance is identifying where is there a bottleneck within the climate space in a specific geography, and why is capital not going into that space? So if we take the India example, renewables, as you said, is growing, seems to be mainstream, but they're up-and-coming sectors, mobility, thinking about waste, water, C&I. What's happening in all those other sectors, and what is the risk associated with that? Capital is not thinking about India and climate. capital is thinking, I just want to maybe just invest in India, or maybe I want to invest across emerging markets. So what can you do in that, from that point of view? So we're saying, well, let's take a first loss so that you don't use India as an excuse, like, oh, I can't take the country risk, I can't take the currency risk, I can't take the regulatory risk, et cetera. And so protect the downside. And we feel that by doing that, we can attract commercial investors to look at the space and say, well, that you don't need to worry about that part. You need to believe in the business models that are being utilized and applied and scaled up within that context. And we all participate on the upside together. Because it's really important that these interventions are temporary. It's temporary is a relative word. Temporary might mean 5 years, 10 years, but they can't be there forever as a subsidy. And a lot of people confuse blended finance with subsidizing an opportunity set. Subsidies are not sustainable. They can kickstart something, but ultimately you need to find a way to ensure that that perceived risk goes away by demonstrating, by scaling.
Wuchong, your sense of blended finance instruments?
Let's see, blended financing, it's about de-risking, right? So I want to talk about what do we do to de-risk. You know, the blended financing is at the project level, but before then, if you want to get to where we need to be in trillions of dollars to bring private sector into countries that are not as attractive for investment destination, there are lots of regulatory framework that you gotta help create the investable environment. Now, there are a lot of partners who can actually work with us. For example, the multilateral banks do have this thing called the policy-based loans, right? Which are into $500 million, that size. So what we can do is help, through very, very close collaboration with the private investors to identify what are the key pain points in terms of the regulatory risk, and then help define the policy framework that needs to be implemented, and then you can help unlock the MDBs, PBL type of instruments. So that's the regulatory side. And then you talk about all these projects out there in the developing South. But then when you ask the investors or bankers, they said there are no projects. That means there are no bankable projects. So we got to move the bankability from blueprint to bankability. So project development and due diligence needs to be done, especially in the upstream for new technologies, for new regions. Like for example, in Togo, we're working with the AF, the Agence France Développement, to do the due diligence for battery storage solutions in Togo. And then direct investments through blended financing, bringing capital in the right way so that you reduce the real risk. Actually, that's the real risk. Now, no matter what you do, in some places, you cannot get rid of perceived risk until you actually demonstrate it once. Even in a place like India, which is much better investment environment, we did this pilot in Delhi to integrate battery storage into the grid. And that didn't require that much capital investment, but it needed to go through the regulatory process, going through the sausage machine to kind of get it through. And then once it's done, that process becomes replicable by others. So that kind of work can demonstrate that things are investable in that region. So I often use this analogy in how to get that to happen. So as I'm getting older, I'm turning into my dad, watching Animal Kingdom, Sunday mornings, and I was actually seeing this film clip where you have hundreds of gazelles stuck next to a river. And then you have these lions coming from one side, and the only way for them to survive is to go on the other side, but the river is full of crocodiles. So what do? There was one brave gazelle that jumped in and miraculously survives. And then once that gazelle survived, everybody jumped in. Now, most of them went through. Few died because they got caught. So those dead gazelles are real risk. Everybody else, actually, they realize that it's actually, if you work collectively, the actual risk is much smaller than you think. And the risk of inaction is actually greater than, because you have lions, don't forget, right? So So what we are trying to do, what we have to do is be that brave gazelle. To be honest, I don't know if that gazelle jumped or he got pushed in, but sometimes you do need to push. So anyway, so these are the kind of de-risking spectrum we're thinking. So I hope that the platform that we can create, we can sit down together and there's actually no competition among us. I mean, we are on the same team. So we need to identify what are the pain points and how we can address that together, or if you don't need to do anything other can do, then that's even better.
So we have the lion of climate change and the crocodiles of risks. And of course, I think capital allocators will not necessarily be pleased to know that they are gazelles that are being pushed into the water. But that's what Wu Chong is doing. He's herding the gazelles. Of course, what we want to do through blended finance is to be able to de-risk, as both Clarissa and Wu Chong have pointed out. And one of the dilemmas that we face when we go and we talk to capital allocators, capital providers, is that they don't necessarily look at climate. It's not as if they have a bucket where they say, okay, I'm going to make these climate investments. What they have is a bucket that says, okay, this is venture capital, or this is growth investing, or this is infrastructure investing. And if you come in and say, okay, give me money for climate, they'd say, no, I'm just going to give you money if you are top quartile in infrastructure, or if you're top quartile in growth investing, right? So we have to be able to find the language and the instruments, the tools that will enable capital allocators, because they have a fiduciary responsibility as well. They're running a pension fund and they have to be able to deliver pensions when they're required. So it is their job to actually generate returns. Now, Clarissa, tell us specifically what are the kinds of blended finance instruments that will enable these capital allocators, I'm not going to call them gazelles, Wu Chong. So what is it that will enable that de-risking to happen? How do we do it? What kinds of instruments can we actually use?
So, as I mentioned earlier, we look at a first loss. So the transactions that we back have a 25%, between 20 and 25% first loss cushion. What does that mean? If things go completely wrong, our capital will pay back to cost up to 25% of any losses. So that gives that investor some comfort that, one, as a manager or as a company trying to make that investment, take a bit more risk and really act faster than they otherwise would. Afterwards, if things do go well, everybody participates on the upside pari passu. There are other examples where an investor thinks, actually, I believe in what you're looking to do, but the returns associated with that just aren't high enough compared to where I could put my capital. So if I have the option of investing in a water company in the US or a water company in the DRC, well, I'd just rather invest in the water company in the US because I believe I'm going to be able to get that capital back. And so to your point about, is there capital allocated, even if people think about infra and what kind of returns they'll get, they're saying, well, what I get in India or what I get in the DRC is going to be much lower. So can you provide a return enhancement mechanism? So can you increase the return that project or fund is going to get through that blended finance vehicle or tranche? There, you can also combine that. You can do debt, you can do equity, you can combine, how much of that upside you share, how much of that downside you share, and how the capital flows afterwards are shared between the investors, so that there is some differential to encourage those capital providers to come into that transaction. And we've been having a lot of discussions around what's actually needed in the case of Indian climate. You are working with a fund that has a track record already, and yet to the point, there is very little capital that says, I want to do India and climate. A lot of the capital allocators are saying, I want to do India as a whole, but why would I do only a climate strategy when the track record that exists there is so limited? Or if you're a climate investor, why am I going to take country risk and only do India? So how do you think about those
It's actually, Clarissa, it's even more difficult than that. When you talk to most institutional LPs, they'll say, I don't even think about Asia or India. I'm just looking at funds. And I'm saying in the infrastructure bucket, I'm looking at top quartile funds. And if the top quartile fund is generating 16% net dollar IRR, investing in Europe or, investing in the US, I'm just going to go there. That's my job. Whether it's India or Africa or Europe or the US, what do I care? I'm just looking at returns. Show me the returns and give me confidence that you can keep generating these returns as a copy-paste formula that you have. So for them to then make a climate allocation, say, I'm interested in India climate, that's not what they're set up to do. So that's where we have to use blended finance and be able to show them that if they're looking for returns, we can generate those returns as well. Wuchong, would you agree with that?
Absolutely. But we also need to, Clarissa talked about the project deal, this de-risking. One of the risk factors is also about the revenue, like the bankability, the whole project. We are starting to look at project in a holistic way. For example, when we are doing solar project in a remote island in Indonesia for provision of cold storage, for example, so that they can actually store the fish catch. We look at it not just from the angle of the solar panel that we help install, but the fisher folks, what kind of impact it has on them. And generally, we've seen potential for double, triple income rise. Same thing in the agriculture sector, similar kind of solar and cold storage for farmer produce. So by pulling the demand, it does provide that additional comfort that it's financially bankable as a system. And then when you look at that, you also have to worry about fishes in the water. Now that you don't have to do. There are other players actually working on that. The Conservation International and other bilaterals who are actually very keen on making sure that there's the sustainable fisheries business. Now, one of the key actions they have to take is restoration of mangroves, which will provide carbon sink as well, right? So when you do that, you also create the opportunity for carbon finance to come in. So all of the above has to be carefully brought into the system so that great blended financing with the concessional money can be supported by this additional revenue flow. So these are some of the things we're exploring. That's why our alliance is getting bigger.
Excellent. We have a few minutes left, and I want to give the audience an opportunity to ask some questions. Yes, the gentleman there in the red shirt, would you like to ask a question? Can somebody get him a mic? Is that possible? Yes. Thank you.
Hi, thank you all. My name is Daniel. I'm the founder of VeryDue AI. We automate due diligence for energy infrastructure investors. And I guess our existential mandate comes from the recognition that hard costs have come down a ton for clean energy infrastructure, but soft costs are ballooning in absolute and in relative terms especially. So I'm wondering how you all are thinking about those soft costs and the kind of slow and expensive processes there and friction points, and whether or not you've explored opportunities for AI to help with that.
Wuchong, as
Yes.
the energy expert.
All of the above. So there are many areas where we can actually let the AI type of new opportunities really come into play. One is about optimizing the grid, for example. We have this pilot that's going on in the state of Rajasthan, where we're creating digital twin of grids so that we can get the local AI application developers to develop applications that will optimize that grid so that you minimize the need for additional capacity. But then also for project development, I know several entities out there, startups, who are looking at using the data that's out there from the MDBs and DFIs and everyone, and using the AI technology to be able to do the due diligence within hours rather than within months. So that would actually relieve the pressure on that. But there's one behavioral thing that we really need to instill. That's spirit of collaboration. If you have one project and if you have DFIs, MDBs, private sector, philanthropies, all doing the same due diligence, it's such a waste. So we need somehow a platform or mechanism that will enable different players to be able to trust each other's due diligence, right? So you don't have to repeat yourself and stress out the project sponsor, because that's going to be crazy as well, right? So to me, I think the behavioral thing is the hardest one to influence, because again, people generally don't like doing something that's different. Again, risk. So that's something that I think all of us can discuss and see how we can move the needle. And I think that can start by having institutions who are established to be able to rely on each other so that there's no repeat.
Terrific. Yes, Sandeep, you have a question.
Thank you for that excellent panel. Just a couple of questions. The science on climate change is indisputable, and several of the startups that are addressing climate change have business models and unit economics that are significantly compelling compared to their fossil fuel counterparts. Why is there then the resistance, and why do you have to work so hard to basically get your philanthropists to provide capital to the climate change area?
I'm going to start with that as an investor in funds, right? So we back manager. ACP itself is based here in New York and cannot be doing direct investing across emerging markets. So the way we provide our capital is to fund managers that are on the ground. We think it's really important that venture capital funds get the funding required to back those startups. Without that, the rest of the chain stops. And so although ACP is looking at slightly later stage, it does early stage development, it doesn't do VC, but it does early stage development, we do want to ensure the ecosystem grows, but then in the case of the markets that we're looking at, it tends to be funded, but then capital stops. And there aren't any capital providers, or very few managers that have capital that are looking to do the ramp up at that next stage. And so from our point of view, again, because our capital is concessional, we're trying to be additive. The capital is already at the beginning. There's pools of capitals later on when the business model is proven and scaled, but there's little capital in that missing middle. So for us, it's important to just go into that middle stage. Now, I think that flow of capital into that early stage has not been as consistent as it should have been, and there was a lot of impetus across Africa, across India, Southeast Asia, and now I think that's a question that we and others like us are grappling with. You know, how far back do you need to go to ensure that that continues?
Wuchong, your thoughts on that?
So the question is, why is it so hard to get philanthropy capital to go into climate related? Yeah, there's a fundamental issue that we need to address. That's these philanthropies generally want to see very quick results, something that you can see the results and put the flag there. Those are generally in the health and education, smaller scale, like food provision of for children and everything. Climate-related investment takes a bit more money, and also a bit more time. So this requires, and there are a lot of simply philanthropies are not sometimes big enough to actually handle one project on their own. So this is where we're trying to encourage collaboration and aggregation, so that you have a platform where we can attract several philanthropies to come in and participate in a collective way in a bigger global agenda with a bit more patience in terms of the output.
Yeah, terrific. Thank you so very much, Wuchong and Clarissa. Thank you, audience, for your participation as well. I hope you enjoyed our discussion on what it'll take to drive decarbonization efforts. And with that, we'll turn it over to the next panel.